Okay, so now our last type that we have to learn how to name, type 3 compounds. So type 3 compounds are covalent. Type 1 and 2 that we already covered are ionic compounds. Type 3 compounds are covalent. Okay, so that means there's no ions. We don't have to worry about any ions. I think that makes it a lot easier. Okay, so these compounds are covalent compounds. They form from covalent bonds. So there's no transfer of electrons. Instead, when these molecules form, they share electrons. So they form bonds by sharing electrons. Okay, to name these compounds, you're going to usually have two nonmetals. Okay, it's a nonmetal and a nonmetal that form a covalent bond. Okay, when you look at the first nonmetal, basically you name the nonmetal and then you add a prefix to indicate how many atoms of that first nonmetal you have. So if you have, let's say your formula is, why don't we say N2O. So your first nonmetal would be nitrogen. N2 means that there's two of them, so you would use the prefix di to name the first part of that, to put the first part of the name. So you would put di-nitrogen to indicate two. And then for the first nonmetal, you never use the prefix mono. So if you just have one atom of that first element, you just put the name of the element. Okay, for the second nonmetal, you always use a prefix to indicate how many atoms of that second nonmetal you have. So for the second nonmetal, you can use mono. Okay, so keep in mind, for the first nonmetal, mono prefix is not used. For the second nonmetal, the mono prefix is used. Okay, and then for the second nonmetal, you do the same as the type 1s and the type 2s. You add the name of the nonmetal, and then you change the ending. You put the IDE ending. So a few subtle differences, mainly that a lot of the formulas have prefixes. Okay, that's a big difference in naming type 3s, is that you have no ions and that you need prefixes. So let's try some examples. Okay, so name the following type 3 compound. So your first nonmetal, so notice you have nonmetal, nonmetal. Alright, so you're going to name the first nonmetal. You only have one carbon, so you do not need to use the prefix mono. You just put carbon. Okay, for the second nonmetal, we have oxygen. We have two oxygens. So you have to use a prefix to indicate that there's two of them. So di means two. And then you still have to change the ending on oxygen, add a suffix. So oxygen becomes oxide. Okay, carbon dioxide. So for that second nonmetal, you always add a prefix and you always change the ending. Okay, for the first nonmetal, sometimes you add a prefix. All right, let's try another example. Name the following type 3 compound. Again, two nonmetals. You have nitrogen. How many nitrogens do you have? You have two. So you have to use a prefix that means two, and that's di. So dinitrogen. And now you have oxygen again. So what prefix indicates four? Mono, di, tri, tetra. So tetra, and oxygen becomes oxide. Okay, now there's still something wrong with that. You have those two vowels that kind of clash here, so it's tetroxide. So drop the A from the prefix and keep the O from the root of oxygen, becomes tetroxide. So you still add a prefix and you still change the ending. And in this case, for the first nonmetal, you did add a prefix. Okay, so the first metal sometimes has a prefix, and the second nonmetal always has a prefix and always has a suffix. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, so you may recognize this as water. Okay, this is just practice, so we're gonna name it according to our rules, but you will always just call this water. I will never really ask you to call this by its scientific name. Okay, so we have hydrogen, and we have two of them. So di means two, and then you put the name of the nonmetal, hydrogen. Okay, that's the first nonmetal. So remember, the only prefix you don't use for the first nonmetal is mono. Every other prefix you do use. So dihydrogen, and then you have one oxygen. So for the second nonmetal, you always use a prefix. So mono for one oxygen, and change oxygen to oxide. So prefix on the first nonmetal, prefix and suffix on the second nonmetal. Obviously, you have to drop one of those vowels when you put the prefix in, or else it would be monoxide. You don't want that. You keep the O, you keep the vowel from the root of the word, and this is the scientific name of water, dihydrogen monoxide, or sometimes it's easier to call these by their common name, water. Okay, but we're just practicing naming. Okay, so like I said, type 3s are a lot easier. Okay, you just have to figure out that it's a type 3 and you have covalent bonds, and then you just use the prefixes and change the ending on the second nonmetal. A lot more straightforward, I think. Okay, so I'm done. Now you can practice and practice, and I'll help you along in class some more throughout the week. Okay.